In this video, you're going to learn all about the importance of context in your worship ministry. That means knowing your church, knowing what they don't need, knowing what they do need, and knowing how and why and when to implement it. Coming up. Hey, Spencer here from leadingworshipwell.com. This is the place where we talk about how to lead yourself well, lead your church well, and lead worship well. In this video, we're talking about context, and I want to talk about it in the context of your worship ministry and really your church in general, because the thing is, you can hear all of these worship leading tips that I give you or any of the other worship leading channels here on YouTube or blogs or whatever, and you can hear all of our ideas, but if you don't actually know the context that you're leading in, then you're just going to be trying to plug in all of these different puzzle pieces, all of these different various tips and systems and ways of doing things. You're going to try to plug those into the quote-unquote puzzle of your church, and you're not even sure if that piece goes in the puzzle that you have in front of you. You have to actually know the context of your church, because what might work in one church might not work in another church, and that doesn't mean that whatever you're comparing is better or worse. It just means that we lead in different environments. And so today in this video, we're going to be talking about that and helping you understand how to figure out what the context of your church is. But before we get into that, I just want to ask you a question real quick, and I want you to go through this process for yourself. What is the context of your church? Like, what context are you leading in? And whenever I ask that, I want you to think about what kind of people form your church. What kind of people are you trying to reach? You know, we can't reach everybody, so sometimes as churches we make the decision to, okay, I can't reach everybody in the entire world, but I can reach this group of people, and we're going to be really intentional about that. So maybe that's how you want to describe your context. And how do you describe your context? What is the context you lead in? Is it a small town? Is it a big city? Is it hipster 20-year-olds? Is it 75-year-old people who retired 10 years ago? We all lead in different contexts. I want to know what contexts you lead in, so let me know in the comments below, and I'll talk to you in a second. Thanks so much for sharing your answer down below. Keep that in mind as we go through this video. And now let's talk about the importance of context in your worship ministry. I want to start off by talking about the importance of context. And it's important because of this. Each church is unique. The church that you lead in is unique. And yes, we're all part of the big capital C church, but we all lead in different environments, in different cultures, really. And think about in the Bible, you know, Paul says, I became, things to all people. He kind of adapted to the culture, not changing the central message that he was sharing, but he understood the context that he was leading in or preaching and sharing the gospel in. And so as the church, we need to do the same thing. And your church has a culture. Your church is unique. And so whenever you hear these tips on the internet or read them or see them or whatever, and you think that's a really cool idea, you need to be able to understand, okay, Spencer's church is in South Central Pennsylvania, and that's completely different than my church, which is in California or something, right? They're different environments, and that's not to say that we can't all learn from each other, but we need to have that filter to run it through to understand the base principle of whatever I'm teaching or whatever somebody else is teaching or whatever you read in a Facebook worship leader group. You need to understand how to transform that, put it through the filter of context, and then let it come out the other side and have it be unique for your church, because your church is unique. So understand that context in worship leading is important because your church is unique. And I think about, we watch Hillsong or we watch Bethel, and then we try to take that to like small town America, or maybe you're in a different country and you're like in this small rural area and you were watching Hillsong New York or something, that is a completely different environment than what you're leading in. And that's not to say that we can't learn from those bigger churches, but understand that your church is unique. And so I want you to focus on this. Take the core principle of whatever you see, not just at the face value, not just Hillsong uses this language and it's really cool and hip, but I'm leading in a church of 75-year-olds for the most part who have a traditional service. Don't just take that thing and just plan it in your church. Understand your church is unique, so we need to filter it through what is the context that we're leading in. The second thing that's important to understand about context is that I want to encourage you, your church needs you. Your church needs you. Your church doesn't need some weird, far off definition of what you think a worship leader should look like. No, your church needs and wants you. They don't want Chris Tomlin leading them. Well, they might want Chris Tomlin leading them, but this is probably not going to happen. And so just be yourself. They don't need Chris Tomlin because Chris Tomlin leads in a specific context. They don't need some other person from Hillsong or Bethel leading them. They need you because you're there. You know the people in your church. You know what they need. You know the context that you're leading in. And no one is able to lead your church like you are able to lead your church. And I just want you to believe that. Like, you are in this position of worship leading right now for a reason. So get to know the context that you're in. Your church needs you. And what that means practically, like I said before, is not trying to be something that you aren't. Maybe you see the people from Mosaic and you see how they dress, right? And you're like, man, if I just dressed like that, I'd be a little bit cooler as a worship leader because they always look super trendy, right? But that's going to be really awkward if I walked in dressed with like one of those small little beanies and had a mustache and had like these oversized sweats on whenever I walk on stage for my church, which is doing a blended service right now because of COVID restrictions. We went to one service for the time being. If I walked in like that on Sunday, people would look at me like I'm crazy, and they'd probably be right because my church needs me. I understand the people in my church, and you understand the people in your church. So just be yourself. You don't have to try to live up to some expectation of what a worship leader is. You are a worship leader. Simple as that. So get to know the people in your church because your people need you. They don't need somebody else leading them. They don't need your picture of what you think a worship leader should look like leading them. They need you in the context that you're leading in to be yourself and lead into that context. And finally, I want to just talk about how to determine whether something actually works in your context. Because like I said, we've got these millions of ideas. We live in the information age where there's millions of ideas on the internet. And how do we filter through that, or filter all of that information through this context filter and figure out what's going to work in our church? Well, I want you to think about this. First of all, in order to understand what's going to work in your church, you need to have an understanding of the people in your church, but also you need to know where you're headed. Where is your church headed? What are they trying to accomplish? And be specific about this, not just we're going to reach lost people. I think we can be a little bit more specific than that. We're going to reach the lost by doing this, this, and this. Or in this specific way, we are going to focus on this for this season of our church right now. And that's going to guide you in understanding, okay, I read this thing on the internet, and is that going to help me accomplish the vision that we have for our church? And if it isn't, then it's probably not worth implementing. But if it is, then you move on to the next step, which is thinking about, okay, how does this apply to the specific people in my church, in the culture that I'm leading in? And you think about it from the perspective of, okay, I've got this idea and it worked in this church. Now, how do I apply that to my church? What is the foundational principle that's being talked about? And how do I put that in my own context? Not like with the different covers and layers that it has on it at that other church, but peel away those layers and put it in the context of your church. And so, for example, I could be talking about doing contemporary worship songs and how I plan those songs for my church. And I think about the one video that I did where I talked about the I, we, God balance, linked up here. Whenever planning your set list, I think that that's a good core, foundational, fundamental way to plan your set lists. But if I'm talking about all contemporary songs and you lead in a more traditional setting, or vice versa, if I was talking about traditional songs and you lead in a contemporary setting, don't just take the whole idea wholesale and throw it into your church. Take that fundamental understanding of what the idea is and put the context around it that you need to serve your church well. And then finally, the last part of that is to just try it. Just try something and see if it works in your church. There are 52 Sundays in a year. You have 52 chances to get things right and get things wrong and learn and improve every single year, and probably more than that because you have more worship gatherings than that throughout the year. But you have at least 52 chances during the year to try things, see if they work, evaluate. If they don't work, don't hold on to an idea because of pride and just be like, well, I thought this was a good idea, but it's not really working, but I'm going to hold on to it because I don't want to be wrong. Don't do that. Say, this didn't work in my context. It doesn't mean that it's a bad idea. It doesn't mean that I made a mistake. It just means I tried something and it didn't work. And that's how you improve your worship leading and figure out what the context is that you're actually leading in. So don't be afraid to just try something and see if it works. Evaluate it. Say, did this accomplish the thing that I was trying to accomplish? And if it didn't, move on with your life. It's going to be okay. Now you know something that doesn't work. You try something else. So don't be afraid to just try some things and see if they work in your context, but don't hold on to them too tightly and never let them go. So there it was. Context, super important in your church. What is the context you are leading in? I want you to define that today. Whenever you're watching this video, this is going to set the foundation for everything you do in your worship ministry. The context is, I serve in this church. We are designed to meet the needs of these people. This is how we do it. If you can answer those questions, then you'll be good to go. You'll know the context of your church and you'll be able to lead your people better. In addition to knowing the context of your church, if you want to improve your worship leading, one way you can do it is to download the free audio training that I put together called 5 Tips to Instantly Improve Your Worship Leading. In that audio training, I talk about 5 things that you just need to know. They aren't hard to do. You just need to know them and make the commitment to implement them into your worship leading, and they will instantly improve your worship leading. So check that out in the description below. It's a free audio training. I'll send it to you. Other than that, thanks so much for joining me today. Until I see you in the next video, keep leading worship well.